Dr. Marc Futernick happens to be the managing editor of the Journal of Climate Change and Health. He is the director of clinical services at the Acute Care Solutions. And Dr. Futernick has made his life a practice on heat effects in human health. And so, Dr. Futernick, please.
Having me here today. Thanks for being here. So the reason those items are important, so I'm an emergency physician, and the reason that background is important is that I work for a group that runs about 400 emergency departments around the country, and so I have a pretty good insight into what's happening in terms of the emergency medicine space, especially on this topic. And being the editor of the Journal of Climate Change and Health, it's important for two reasons. One, it just shows how broad and deep this topic is. There's no way I can cover it in a few minutes, so I'm going to hit some major highlights. But there's a lot to talk about in this space and the impact that climate change has on health. Also to tell you that everything I'm going to tell you is not a prediction or a theory. These are all based on studies. This is what's actually happening to our health right now. And the reason I'm here, because I'm going to talk about stuff that's very different than what you're going to hear about the rest of the day, is to really get into the why. Why is this so important? Change is really hard. Why must we change what we're doing? So, I'm not going to spend any time on this. I hope everybody in the room understands the greenhouse effect. But what I want to talk about is that it's getting hotter. Again, I'm not going to talk about the future. This is what has already happened. And so the point of these graphs is to show that these are standard deviations at the bottom. So 3 standard deviations of way something happens less than 0.1% of the time. So this is the distribution of hot days in the northern hemisphere back when, I guess when I was a kid, when I was born and even a little earlier. And as we progress, you'll see that the temperature shifts. But as we get to, how far I go? Sorry, one less. You can see how many extremely hot days we have, and this is probably 10 years old data, so we have even more now. Extremely hot days that never existed before. And that's why you have so many people telling you stories. I imagine they're telling me stories all the time. I was out doing this thing that I used to do, and I started having heat cramps and all these other symptoms. So this is real. It's getting hotter. So I'm going to talk for a minute about how our body handles heat, because I think it's pretty self-explanatory that we need to keep our temperature into a nice normal range near 98.6 before we start to suffer ill effects. I bet you all feel pretty bad when your temperature is 101. I don't know when the last time your temperature was 104, but you would feel really, really quite horrible. It's amazing that kids tolerate that. Most of the time we cool our bodies by being in a cooler environment. We've got lots of ways. You can see on the graph, you probably learned this in high school, we kind of convect and radiate our energy. But what if it's 99 degrees or hotter outside? None of that works. We do have one mechanism that works extremely well, and that's perspiration. That's when we sweat. We put a little water on the surface. When that water evaporates, it pulls a little bit of energy off our skin. Every one of these molecules is doing that, so it cools our body. But what if the water can't evaporate? What if it's extremely humid and the water doesn't evaporate very quickly or at all? The body doesn't cool. And that's how we get into this heat index and the feels like. It feels like because that's how your body is truly reacting. The reason you still feel hot when it's hot and humid out is because your body is not cooling. And so it's still suffering and still signaling to you, I'm having a problem here, I'm still too hot, we're heating up. We're going to get into a little exercise with the heat index. Let's see, I have some different versions of this, sorry. But we can just pick a temperature. Let's say it's 100 degrees. And out here, when it's 100 degrees in California, I still go play tennis because if it's 25% humidity, it still feels like about 100 degrees, 101 degrees, and we can tolerate that. But if it's 50% humidity, which is not unusual around here, you can see what the 100 feels like. But I'm from Miami. And so if we get to just the same 100 degrees, but 75% humidity, and it's literally intolerable. You would die out there without artificial cooling. Your body is incapable of cooling yourself at that temperature. That's why it's off the chart. Now, relative to what we're going to talk about today, when we start talking about urban heat island and things of that nature, that effect on a really hot day typically is in that 8 to 10 degree range. So let's pick a 50% humidity and a 95-degree day and start to think about what it would be like if it was 5 degrees or 10 degrees hotter. It doesn't just feel 5 or 10 degrees hotter, it jumps exponentially. So if we can get into these cities and it's 110 degrees and we can bring it down to 100 degrees, we're really going to change outcomes. What kind of outcomes? Let's talk about this. I just wanted to show this just to show you kind of how complex the physiology is. This is actually just 3 systems that are affected by the heat. So one, they get into how it takes a lot of demand on your heart because you're increasing your blood flow and your cardiac output to get a lot of blood flow out to the skin to try to cool your body. That takes a lot of energy. Imagine if you have cardiac impairment, this could be lethal for you. Another system talks about how it's dehydrating, you sweat a lot, you lose electrolytes and water. That also impacts the perfusion of your kidneys, can develop into kidney failure. The inflammatory reaction of the heat that creates endotoxins in your body, that creates increased permeability, and allows toxins to flow into your GI tract. Again, these are just 3. All of our organs are impacted. And to me, I want to just leave you with a little bit of practical knowledge before we get into more detail around this, and that's that heat stroke is the most important thing to understand and to recognize. And the reason is because if your temperature is getting up to 103, 104, you feel bad, your kidneys are failing, your liver is failing, your heart is strained, but I can't see any of that. And I can't see your brain, but we can all see how each other's brains are functioning. And that's what we're really interested in. So if it's hot out, or someone is exercising, and they're slurring, or they're confused, or they're wobbling, or they pass out, their brain is not working. Their body is too hot. They have heat stroke. That's why we called it that. Heat stroke is no joke. If you don't do something about heat stroke, 80% mortality. What if I put that into context? If you have a heart attack, sounds extremely serious, is extremely serious. We have whole networks set up to handle that. The mortality is about 5%. But if you have heat stroke, and somebody doesn't come pull you down, you have an 80% chance of dying. This is absolutely lethal. So if you find somebody in heat stroke, you need to cool them right away. The best way to cool them is with an ice tub. I've done the medical support at the LA Marathon. We've always had an ice tub at the end. I used the ice tub. I believe I saved a life with the ice tub. There's lots of other ways when things are more mild. I'm not going to get into all of that, but cooling and fanning and things that just make sense, cool water. But just recognize heat stroke as a medical emergency that it is. So this is a really big deal. When we look at the stats and we look at heat waves compared to hurricanes, wildfires, etc., it's the biggest natural event killer. But that is just the tip of the iceberg, because it doesn't take into account the way heat affects all of those other organs we just talked about. And if you take a step back and you look at what happens during a heat wave, this is what happens, and it's pretty frightening. So going bit by bit, more people die. That will make sense when we get into the details. More people have heart attacks and strokes because of the strain on their cardiovascular system. Number 1 and number 3 killers in the Western world. More people have respiratory issues. Those that have asthma know that when the heat comes, they're going to have bad asthma. I see people nodding because we create more ground level ozone, which is a respiratory irritant. So even just from a chemical standpoint, it's going to be worse. But some of these other things we didn't understand until we started looking at it. More people deliver early, preterm babies. This is not something that was done in a rural area in India. These studies were done at Kaiser in California. So think about that. Every single patient in the study had health insurance, had a hospital to go to with air conditioning, cool IV fluids to handle their dehydration, tocolytics, medications to stop the delivery from happening early, and still more babies born early due to heat wave. Then think about the lifelong effects of preterm babies. Some of the things that they end up having last their entire lives. So think about, again, the impact of a heat wave on our future. Hot under the collar. This is a real thing. More people stab and shoot each other with a higher severity. And summer is trauma season for our trauma centers. I work at a trauma center. More psychiatric illness. I used to think when I was in training that, it's hot out. If you're depressed or you're homeless, you want to come inside where it's cooler. But the truth is that when we take a step back and we look at the numbers, more suicides are completed when it's hot out. And let's talk about one more scary thing. We simply don't think as well when it's hot out, both on that day and if we've been exposed to heat for the previous months. So this combines a few different studies, but if you look on the right, this isn't on the day of retaking the PSAT, so everybody's their own control. This had to do with them being exposed to heat over the previous 6 months, and the more heat kids were exposed to over the previous 6 months, the worse they did on the PSAT. Now think about that. How are we going to handle the challenges of our world if we can't think or create or strategize as well? We have got to do something about this heat. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk a lot about the urban heat island effect. I want to just talk about a couple of quick points as we're going to get into more detail, and that's about shade trees. Now, some of that is really obvious. They create a lot of shade. I imagine most of you have walked into a forest, and what do you notice? You notice how cool it is. But it's not just shade. And many of you may know this, but some may not. Trees have their own form of perspiration called transpiration. Trees pull water out of the ground and they release it out of their leaves. And when that water turns into vapor, it pulls some energy, just like when we perspire. So the trees actually make the temperature cooler in addition to shading. So that's why they're such an important combination for what we're talking about. Oh, I see. So this is something that's been known for a long time. There are case reports all the way back into the 1980s about bad asphalt burns for various reasons, but it's become so common in our cities that we see these kind of news reports. And I don't know if you've read these, but I'm going to kind of detail the story because it's absolutely frightening. So we'll start with the asphalt in cities like Phoenix, where it's 115 now, can get to between 160 and 180 degrees. So that could cause a second-degree burn in seconds, 10, 20 seconds. So one of the stories from these articles is an older gentleman who was simply walking across the street from his house, and he trips on the road. And so he falls on the ground. So he puts his hands down to try to push himself up, but the ground is 170 degrees. So just that push on the ground instantly has third-degree burns on his hands. So he tries with his forearms. That doesn't work either, and so he just starts screaming and rolling around on the ground until somebody comes and saves him. This gentleman spent months in a burn unit with third-degree burns all over his body because he tripped crossing the street. So, again, we've got to do something about this. So you're going to hear a lot more than I even understand about this, but this is just a quick depiction of the albedo effect. The important thing to know is that Earth's average is moving in the wrong direction because of melting sea ice and things of that nature. We're becoming darker, and we're absorbing more of the Earth's sun when we need to absorb less of it, and that's the whole point of why we're here today. This is a quick rundown of what I see as some of the real advantages of cool surfaces. So we've got their flexibility both in terms of color and location. They reduce the surface temperature. We know now they also reduce the ambient temperature. There's a greenhouse gas equivalent effect, which maybe is complex to calculate, but is certainly real. And then maybe they can make the roads last longer. We'll talk about some of those things. What I like, there's no entrenched opponents. There's no fossil fuel industry saying don't pave my street. And it's ready for deployment now. We know how to do it. I want to pause and make a comment. I've seen some studies and some talk about the increased exposure to radiation because now the ground didn't absorb half of it. It kicked some of that back up in your body. And so I can see how you could calculate a little bit more heat coming back up from the ground. But our bodies are incredibly complex physiologic machines. And I believe that far and away the most important is our ability to perspire and evaporate that sweat and cool our body. That's what really works. That's what works when we're running. That's what works when it's really hot out. And I believe that these things will help supplement that by cooling the air a little bit, and I postulate it may even reduce the humidity a little bit above these cool surfaces. But certainly just a few degrees, 3, 4, 5 degrees, go back to your heat index now, makes a huge, huge difference in our ability to cool ourselves down physiologically, which I think is important to consider. The bottom line is, I think we need human studies on this. It's great to calculate radiative forces, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do all of that, and I know the room is full of people who do that, But I really believe we need physiologic studies. We need humans out on the surfaces measuring how they feel, because we're actually excellent at detecting what's wrong with us based on how we feel. So don't ever ignore that you feel badly in the heat. That is real. That's why you feel bad. But our heart rate, our temperature, other physiologic parameters like that we can easily measure when people spend time on these surfaces, and then decide how they really compare. So I think that's our next step. Probably running out of time. This is not applying to people in this room. I'm so appreciative that so many people are here. But it kind of feels like this is what we're doing, right? We're just playing golf when the world is burning behind us. So we've got to stop. It's time to change. And thanks for being here.
Well, I want to embarrass Dr. Futernick. In the event that there's someone in the audience with a burning question for him that he could feel right now, I think it's important. You guys are part of this this day. We're not just talking at you. We want to hear from you. Yes, please. Can you stand and ask your question?
Thank you. I greatly appreciate you. Can everybody hear me? I think I can see I live in an area in the Coachella Valley similar to Phoenix, where we spend 5-6 months out of the year over 100. We used to have maybe 3 or 4 days when we'd say we can handle 120, and now easily 2 weeks over 120 in the summer. How can we incentivize or be sure that when people come into the ER, they document exposure to heat and not just the condition that brought them there? Because if we can justify having more cooling centers, if we say the heat was the problem, not an underlying diabetes or kidney failure, how can we make sure that these the statistics are being tracked? Because we know data equals dollars, data equals decisions. How can we make sure that we get that information out there?
It's a really excellent question. For those who haven't heard it, how can we get the doctors to code the heat rather than whatever the final diagnosis is? And it's a great question I've been asked many, many times. And it's really, really difficult because when you see a patient having a heart attack during a heat wave, I'm just going to write down heart attack. Now, I agree, those people like me, there are codes for it. Environmental exposure, heat exposure, I could add that, and I would, but the truth is, most doctors are not thinking about this top of mind, and it's just like everything else, we need to kind of make it systemic. So it's a great question. I don't know the answer, but it's incredibly common because that was the point of the slide. We see all of these other things. So when we see a miscarriage during a heat wave, we tend to code patients having a miscarriage. That's what I get paid for. So it's a really difficult problem. Yes?
Can I ask just a follow-up?
Sure.
Connected to that question is, what sort of creative brainstorming ideas are being workshopped in this medical and space of trying to capture and document all of the people who are undocumented or feel very threatened to get medical attention even before what we're seeing with the ice raids? What, kind of tracking can we do, not just to document it, but to encourage them to get medical support?
Yeah, for those that don't know, this has been a really difficult time for healthcare for our immigrant population. I work at California Hospital. It's very much an inner city safety net hospital. I kid you not, when the ice raids came around and the protest started, our volumes dropped 30 to 40% in the emergency department. That's how many people were staying home. We haven't seen that since COVID. Even COVID was when we were staying home. So this is a real phenomenon. We put out a lot of information to try to let people know that we're going to, in a sense, play by the rules, meaning if they don't have a warrant, they can't go inside, they can go inside to safe spaces. But you know what's happening in the community. People just aren't going outside at all. So
well, they go into surgical rooms and are carrying people away. So they're maybe.
Well, they're not following the law.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a really difficult problem. So it's hard to say, oh, you're absolutely safe here. But of course, it's just like COVID. We think you should come if you're having a serious problem.
That's not a question.
Kind of two-part question. So for people who don't have air conditioning, but they have sensitive medications in their house, is there a point where extreme heat to grace them, and then those who are, now that diabetes is more prolific and they walk around with a blood glucose monitor, and is that affected by like their body's heat, and then they're screwed up and it doesn't give accurate readings of their blood sugar level?
Yeah, these are such good questions. Right out of the gate, so many medications impact our response to heat. So people often talk about like these vulnerable groups and babies and elderly, but when you start adding them up, more of us are in a vulnerable group than are not, because most psychiatric medications impair your perspiration response. Most blood pressure medicines impair your cardiac response. So the whole point of the blood pressure medicine is to keep your heart rate slower or keep your blood pressure down. So what about when you need that extra oomph because it's hot out? So the medications make a big difference, and obviously storage of medications is a big issue, especially, let's say, on homeless populations or populations that can't keep refrigeration going, which is often an issue. So many aspects. I haven't heard about that with the with the insulin pump being changed, but there are so many medication changes, diuretic and allergic. All of those things affect how we respond to heat. So many more of us are at risk than people realize.
Yeah, this may be a crazy question or odd question, but we're assuming that everything is changing around us and we're staying constant. But is it possible that we're actually adapting to all the changes that are happening around us? Is there any studies that, because we know that climate has been changing throughout history, right? And even man, some people in certain areas become taller maybe, or, we live in different geographic regions and we have different resiliencies. I mean, is it possible that we're really not constant also adapting? Are there any studies
It's a great question because there's two sides of it. Number one, we're absolutely adapting because we're amazing physiologic creatures, and that's why climatization is so important. And I don't know if you know, but California, to my knowledge, is the only state with a true acclimatization law for outdoor workers, where they're only allowed to work, let's say, 3 hours for the first week and 5 hours for the second week. And I see applauding in the back because I think the number is 70% of all heat-related occupational deaths happen in the first week. It's because we're not used to it. Same thing, the most dangerous heat waves are in a temperate area, the first big heat wave of the season, because our bodies do acclimate over the course of a couple of weeks. So we reduce that heart rate response, we reduce our sweat and salt response so that we don't waste it earlier. We do get used to the heat. But now I'm going to flip to the other side. Can't we adapt to this? And I'm going to use the word evolve to this. Our environment is changing and we evolve. And that will happen. But the time course of evolution for human beings, for any animals on the planet that are like mammals, is not on the order of years or decades. It's on the order of tens of thousands of years. So it will take us tens of thousands of years for our bodies to get used to a temperature that's 5 or 10 degrees hotter. But that's going to happen in a couple of decades. So we're not going to be able to evolve our way out of this.
So let's thank Dr. Futernick.